When you think of the Falklands, chances are the first thing you think of is war.
They took off from airfields in southern Argentina, equipped with Exocet missiles.
Both ships were hit. Sir Galahad was immediately in flames.
Maybe Margaret Thatcher?
We come to talk to the people here, to pay tribute to those who liberated the islands.
Maybe the British Empire? Maybe Gibraltar comes to mind. Maybe you remember watching the conflict unfold on your television screen, seeing British forces fight to defend a small rugged landscape 8,000 miles away. But there's a lot more to the Falkland Islands than 74 days of conflict 40 years ago. The story of the islands and of the islands themselves is rich, unique, and sometimes strange. The conflict, while a small part of the island's history, marks a turning point for the Falklands, a point that creates a duality, a before and after, a rural, difficult life, transforming into one of relative prosperity for its inhabitants. Since then, the way of life for Falkland Islanders has forever changed. You're listening to The Falklands Way of Life, a short podcast series produced by Falkland Islands Television. I'm your host, Charles Kershaw, and in this short series I explore the lives of inhabitants living in the remote British Overseas Territory and how life has changed over the past 200 years. This is The Falklands Way of Life.
The Falklands, they got their own personality, if you like.
I have good memories of that time. Our standards of living were lower then, but I think generally people probably appreciated what they had.
We're going to have to accept the fact there's going to be a new Falklands. We cannot stay an anachronism, and we're achieving that now.
All the change pretty much has been for the better in my eyes.
Between the late 1900s and 1960s, life in the Falklands hadn't changed all that much. It had experienced some slow technological progress, but had stayed behind the times, with relatively limited connection between its small settlements and with the outside world. The simple rural life of the Falklands have remained largely the same. But many who lived that lifestyle look back on it fondly.
I mean, I have good memories of that time. I was very young then, but what's an interesting thing to compare now is that our standards of living were lower then, but I think generally people probably appreciated what they had a bit more in those times. And all the memories, or most of the memories I have, are all good memories of growing up then. You know, we had quite a carefree sort of lifestyle, and I mean, we weren't paid a lot, but, you know, as I say, people were happy with what they had at the time. My name is Tony Smith. I was born and have been living in the Falkland Islands for 60 years.
So you grew up in the Falklands. Did you grow up on West Falkland?
I did, yes, that's right. Yeah, I lived on West Falkland up until 1988. We lived on a few farms when I was still going to school. When I finished school, I had a cousin living at Port Stephens, right in the south. I think he invited me to go there for a bit of a holiday after I finished school. And they offered me a job there and just driving tractors and so on, which, you know, as a 16-year-old, that was all good fun. An opportunity arose for to train a mechanic there, and I was approached by the farm manager and I was offered that position, you know, to do an apprenticeship to become the farm mechanic and electrician, which was quite a responsible job, you know, having to maintain all the machinery on the farm, basically. That was one of the big original farms, so it was, when I say big, 250,000 acres. We had about 50,000 sheep, and in total the community was around between 40 and 50 people.
Farms before the war were much larger than they are today, run by a handful of absentee landlords based in the UK. Hours on the farm were long, and farming, as it had been in the previous century, continued to be tough and physically demanding work. Every farm was run by a farm manager, who exercised a lot of authority in how settlements were run as a whole. The lack of roads kept people within their isolated communities. So you spent most of that time like on the west. Did you go over to the East Falklands much at all, or go into Stanley or anything like that?
We didn't actually in those days. I mean, it wasn't exactly cheap to get to Stanley. The only easy way to get in was with the FIGAS, the Falkland Islands Government Air Service. But yeah, as you know, like I was saying, back in those days, we weren't paid so much. So generally, a lot of people might come to Stanley once a year. You know, it'd be quite a a big event when you came to Stanley, you know, the only town. It just seemed like quite a big place, you know, compared to these farms, and just seeing so many more people and the activity in our one and only town.
I would say, you know, it probably felt like a city, but I mean, I suppose it
Yeah,
is a city
really.
now. So
Yeah, no, it did back then. You know, it seemed like a big, bustling sort of place. You know.
One of the largest farms in the islands before the war was Fox Bay Farm on West Falkland, owned by absentee landlords the Pack brothers. Richard Cockwell came from the UK to work for them in the mid-60s, before becoming their farm manager. Those are your sons, is that Sam and then...
Sam, Adam and Ben.
And Ben is still at Fox Bay, isn't he?
Ben's at Fox Bay.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, they were all brought up in Fox Bay, wild as hawks, still are. I got a job working as a shepherd up on Salisbury Plain until I could get a passage on the ship to Australia. I was 17 when I signed up, so it only cost me £5. I worked in Australia on sheep farms and such like in the bush. Really enjoyed it, loved it, great place, great work. Everything was great except the heat. I couldn't cope with the heat. And so I finished up coming down by sea to Fox Bay in the Falklands. It was a 150,000 acre sheep farm in those days. And I took over as manager in 1968, I think it was.
What was the community like in Fox Bay at that time? Because I mean, you must have been quite close. Are you always working together? You spent all the time together?
Yeah, it was fine. I mean, we had Fox Bay West as well, which was quite an advantage. So Fox Bay itself was quite a large community. The manager in those days was very much the manager who dealt with everything, really. A lot of people, they asked you to look after their money for them. All their tax returns and everything were done by the manager. It was quite a big job, really.
How many sheep did you kind of look after on Fox Bay when you were manager?
When I took over, I think it was about 26,000. And I think when the farm was sold, it was somewhere around about 33,000. There were an awful lot of the farms were overseas because the original settlers, the original people who set up the farms and set up the companies, retired and went back to Britain. But basically they were totally run in the Falklands.
Did you want to go down and have a look at the shearing shed?
Yeah, that'd be good, yeah.
So this is the building that we brought over the mountain before the roads, and the piece on the side we've added, you know, later on.
Right. I'm at Richard Stevens' farm, Port Sussex, about 2 hours by car from Stanley, on the west part of East Falkland. Richard bought the farm in the 1990s. Before the war, it was part of the much larger farm of San Carlos. Richard came to work in the Falklands as a travelling teacher in June 1977, after seeing a job advert in the UK. With only one school in the capital, Stanley, children were and are still taught in camp through a mixture of teaching in person on farms from travelling teachers like Richard, and with lessons over the telephone. Richard's many fond memories of his first few years in the Falklands are chronicled in his book Before, During and After the Falklands War. In it, he describes his adventures across various settlements, from diving for copper on the shores of the islands, to the lively male-only cookhouse at Charters, to delivering mail to houses by throwing it out of the window of a small propeller plane while flying overhead.
It was in a newspaper, that bit, but what newspaper I just can't remember now. Yeah. And I applied for it, and I remember they wrote back and that opportunity had already gone, but they said they'd put me on file. And like when people say they've put you on file, you think, that's it, you know, forget it. You know, don't call me and I won't call you. But about 6 months later, they did. Anyway, a little while later, they offered me the job.
Coming to the Falklands, I mean, what were your initial reactions? What were the things that really stuck out to you as being so different from the UK?
I guess it was like it was stepping back in time, but it was also, because it was so different, it was like living an adventure because of, you know, travelling. There weren't that many vehicles and everybody was so self-sufficient. I think that was another thing that struck me.
You know, going from settlement to settlement, that must have been quite a challenge to be riding on horseback for long periods of time, right?
Yeah, well, I was sort of fortunate that I did know how to ride. But the combination was really riding the Falkland Way and also finding your way about. The farm's this way, the house is this way, take you a couple of hours probably. I don't know where the track is. It's all right, the horse knows the way. And so off we went. And it took me ages because, of course, I didn't trot a lot of the time. I sort of walked and, you know. For the traveller, really, I found it quite difficult just because it was mentally draining. If you had a small group of children would look more towards you for inspiration or new ideas. But then in the bigger groups in camp, there'd be a huge range of children.
And I mean, yeah, it must have been quite a big mix of abilities and age ranges.
Yeah.
I mean, also growing up here, do you think like the children are a bit more kind of outdoorsy and they don't necessarily want to be in a classroom? That's my perception. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, I think looking at it, because basically as a traveller, the kids knew that they could stick you for 2 weeks and then hopefully the beaver would get in and you'd go. And then it was up to them to do homework, to sort of keep up. And then if all went well, the weather was good and the beaver flew, I'd be back within a month. And then they'd have to put up with me for another 2 weeks. For people living on the farms, it was sort of quite hard work because, you know, it's a long day in the summer if you're a shepherd.
On the farms in the summer months, we would start at 6 a.m, work for 2 hours, have a stop for breakfast, work for another hour or so, then we'd have another mid-morning tea break, which was known as smoko. Then another hour or so, then we'd have a 1 hour lunch break, then another hour or so, and then we'd finish around 4 or 4:30 in the afternoon. So they were long days, particularly in the summer. And as a young person, there was always, you know, a variety of things to do and that. So it was really, we quite enjoyed the lifestyle.
So what kind of things were you doing when you weren't working?
Most of the young single guys had a motorbike, so we would, at every opportunity, we'd be off on our bikes, you know. One real advantage was these big farms, no roads, but you could ride pretty much anywhere off-road. We also had some small boats there. We'd go out in boats on days when it wasn't too windy. Then through the winter months, I mean, we had a little sort of a social club there for the community. So we had a bar and one of the old film projectors. We would show our own films and things. So we kept ourselves quite occupied. But we had a radio telephone service, and that was, I mean, that was pretty reliable.
The thing was about communications. We had the RT, the radio telephone, which worked from, I think it was 7:30 till 4 o'clock or 4:30. After that, it was shut off. We were totally isolated.
The one thing we had to do, though, if you wanted to, say, for example, if I wanted to contact somebody here in Stanley from where we were on West Falkland, we'd have to go to the manager's house and ask to use the radio that was situated in the manager's house. Whereas today, you just pull your phone out of your pocket and make a call anywhere in the world, you know. And because we did that so infrequently back then, I remember I really didn't like speaking on the radio, you know, or on the telephone for that matter.
There were social events where everybody used to get together and have dances and such like. Two-nighters. You still hear of two-nighters, but they're very different from the days when people used to turn up on horseback.
Is that when people kind of stay for 2 nights?
They stay for 2 nights,
party for 2 days, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There wasn't much point in staying for just one night. So they had a full day on the farm. And there was the sports, which was very different from the sports these days. Horse racing, all the shepherds and people had horses and such like, so there are an awful lot more horses, dances every night. They used to go on for a week. And so that was the break between shearing and then when we had to start dipping all the sheep.
Again, you made other sort of forms of entertainment. You know, people would play at home or in our social club, and that you would also play card games and things like that. You know, you didn't invent your own entertainment.
The cookhouse could be quite lively because it was the young lads and the young shepherds, and There wasn't any entertainment like video or TV, smartphones, nothing. So you had to sort of find your own entertainment, and it could be a bit wild at times.
I think the one that stands out for me of the anecdotes that you say in the book is throwing like live rounds on the fire. I couldn't believe that I heard that.
I mean, looking back at it, you think, holy, how did people not get hurt? But I did see that, like, let's say a few times. There's no better way to clear a room.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it did. When it comes to, living out in the West, even now, there is always, I think about, what if there's a big medical emergency, and what would you do in that situation? What was that like then? Because I know that you had a bit of an accident at one point with a handsaw, right?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, even back then, they managed generally very well. It was rare for someone to die because of some medical emergency. They could generally get you back to Stanley or get you treatment somehow. There were always a few people around who were trained in sort of basic first aid and stuff. And yeah, because as you mentioned, I had a few accidents working as a mechanic, and quite often it was the manager's wife who sort of patched me up.
I think there was a lot of bartering back in the day. So if people were good at mechanicking, perhaps they'd say, look, I'll give you a sack of potatoes if you do this to my Land Rover. There wasn't much alternative. You couldn't, like you can today, you couldn't go down to the chandlery or to the FIC and get potatoes off the shelf. Not just like that, or the fresh fruit or the variety of vegetables. It just wasn't available.
All in all, life hadn't changed dramatically in the Falklands for quite some time. But there did seem to be a charm, perhaps because of the additional freedom and community spirit that those who were there remember. But by the time of the 1970s, the Falklands was experiencing a serious decline. Job prospects outside of sheep farming in the islands were few and far between, and falling wool prices meant that many struggled to make ends meet. By the time of the war in 1982, the population had gone down from about 2,500 to only 1,800. Those who did leaving for the UK, where there were more opportunities. Going into kind of the 70s and maybe early 80s, a lot of people kind of started leaving the islands. Population went down. Did you ever think about leaving at that time?
I was convinced I was going to stay. I ran the family's dairy farm in England for 4 years, but I was more my own boss working in the Falklands. There was much less interference and such like. By the time it came to sell up the farm, and I didn't remain in farming, I was committed to the Falklands. It's become my life, really. As manager, I was allowed to go on leave every 3.5 years, but I found 4 weeks in the UK was enough for me. I was waiting to come home again.
So Falklands became your home?
But this is my home, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm absolutely fixated on the Falklands and its future and its people and everything else.
What kind of convinced you to stay, after you finished that first contract that you did as a teacher?
I just liked it. It was like, as I say, to me, it was an adventure. Here I was, riding people's horses for nothing. And then, like off-road, it was always rather good fun. And I suppose I just didn't think of that side of it. I didn't get to that stage. But yeah, no, a lot of people, the young lads, used to join the ships that came in. Some of the young girls used to marry Marines. And so there was a strong sort of trickle of people leaving the islands.
In 1975, the British government commissioned a report examining the Falklands' economic situation. The report was named after the leader of the House of Lords at the time, Sir Edward Shackleton, and was called the Shackleton Report.
When Lord Shackleton came down in 78, 79, I can't remember when it was, I can remember talking to them then about the fact that the farms were too big, and anyone who thought they were doing a good job managing a farm as big as this were really kidding themselves, because they were just too big and unmanageable, and so you had to have too many staff. they just weren't viable. And that's why I didn't carry on farming myself.
This process of splitting up farms went on about the 80s and probably finished within 10 years, 11 years. And so people like us will be doing the same kind of thing, you know, all over the islands.
Do you kind of miss life, you know, before 82 or living out in camp? Are there aspects of that you miss?
I mean, I love living in camp, and if it was possible, I would live in camp. But I always said, when the Zimmer frame won't get over the grass bogs, it's time you move to town. And so I did move beforehand, but now, you know, you have to accept things.
You know, everybody seemed to have more time for each other. You didn't need to know what was happening in Coronation Street, you know. Coronation Street wasn't an option, so you sort of like, you were more involved with actual community. On Saturdays or Sundays, they'd pop round to see friends for, you know, a coffee and a cake or a tot, and you know, put the world to rights. And you know, you probably, you know, a mate you probably send a WhatsApp to, or something very modern like that.
It's nice to think back to those times, but no, personally, you know, I wouldn't like to go back and live on a farm now and go back to that lifestyle. But I mean, it was a good experience at the time, but I'm happy with my life as it is now, sort of thing. Yeah, and there's many more opportunities. That's an important thing. There were very limited opportunities back then. It was very, very limited, very restricted, really, what you could do. I mean, it was difficult to get money to start a business, and there were these, you know, just a few big companies around that had a complete monopoly on lots of services. So if you're one individual trying to start a business, you know, you couldn't compete with some of the big businesses or companies that existed here.
The Shackleton report made some crucial recommendations, which over the coming years changed the Falklands forever. But all progress had to be put on hold on the 2nd of April 1982, when long-standing tensions between the UK, the Falklands and Argentina reached a boiling point.
There is mounting evidence that the Argentine armed forces are preparing to invade the Falkland Islands.
Government House is now surrounded. Stanley is completely surrounded by armoured vehicles and troops. Hundreds and hundreds and maybe even thousands of troops are now in Stanley.
Next time on the Falklands Way of Life, the aftermath of the 1982 Falklands War and how the Falklands changed overnight.
There were some big changes that happened quite rapidly then. The speed of development was you know, much quicker than it had been in my lifetime before that.
I mean, the general population had to get used to the whole idea of there being different industries and how to service them.
It is totally different now. It's made a huge difference, you know, in terms of our business connectivity and our kind of social connectivity to the wider world. It's made us a more multicultural sort of society.